It's time to put a bow around September and wrap up my reading for the month. Hello book friends, I'm Jen and welcome to my reading life and welcome to my September reading wrap up. September was another wonderful reading month for me. I had a lot going on and I didn't think that I was going to read as much in September as I actually ended up reading, but it was a pretty good reading month for me. I wrote down some stats which I will share with you before we get into all of the books that I read last month. And first off, I read 13 books. I had 12 fiction and 1 nonfiction. And full disclosure, one of those books was a DNF, which I read about 50 pages of. So I guess in actuality, I read 12 books. So I had the 1 DNF. 2 of the books were rereads for me. And then I read 1 book off of my TBR 24 and 24. And I'm feeling like I am a little bit behind. I have 6 books left to read. And I guess technically that's 2 books a month till the end of the year. I don't know. I just made some changes to my TBR 24 and 24 and I posted about that on my Instagram account if you would like to check out. I did some swapping of a couple of books and I showed which books I have still left to read. So if you're interested in that, you can always find the link to my Instagram account in the description box below this video. And then lastly, and maybe most importantly, I had 3 5-star reads, 3 books that I read in September I absolutely loved and can't wait to share them with you and try to entice you all to pick them up as well. Or not, if it doesn't sound like your cup of tea, which is perfectly okay. Read what you want. But let's just get into the books, shall we? I think I'm going to start and share the 2 books that I reread first, and then I've been liking going through the books in the order that I enjoyed them so that we end up on a really lovely note at the end of the video with my top reads of the month. So I'm going to continue doing that this month as well. But let us start with my 2 rereads, which I absolutely loved. They were fantastic the second time around. I'm so glad that I reread both of them this month. And the first one couldn't be more apropos for September, and that is September by Rosamund Pilcher. I actually ended up listening to the audiobook of this, which was wonderful, and I highly recommend it. If you have not listened to this or read this one and want to, the audiobook is definitely a good way to go. Either way, I think this is a wonderful story. We actually start the story of this novel in May, and then it takes us through September. So anytime I think from May through September is a lovely time to read this book if you like to read seasonally. So pick this up whenever it sounds good to you, but reading it in September is fun because it does end in September. So that's just kind of a lovely way to have it match your season that you're reading it in, even though my September was extremely hot here in California this year. But this is just another village life story from Rosamund Pilcher, and we follow a number of different characters. We actually follow one character from The Shell Seekers, shows up in September. So if you haven't read either The Shell Seekers or September, I recommend starting with The Shell Seekers so that you can meet that character first and then see how you get to know them from a different perspective in September. So that's all I will say about that. This is such a lovely, lovely read. Another gem by Rosamund Pilcher. And then my second reread was my very favorite book by one of my very favorite authors, and that was Happy All the Time by Laurie Colwin. And I buddy read this with my friend Elizabeth, and this is just such a delightful novel, and I'm not sure why, but something about it just says fall to me. And when I look back at when I have read this book, I have often read it in the fall months, and it feels like autumn in New York, like the song or the movie When Harry Met Sally, which is one of my favorite movies. It just, something about it to me just has that same kind of flavor and tone, and so I really enjoy reading this one in the fall. So it's good to read any time of year. Happy All the Time follows 2 couples. We follow Vincent and Misty and Guido and Holly, and we start before they have entered into their relationships, and then we follow them throughout quite a bit of time in their relationships and how they develop. And you just get to know these characters. You get to know their friends and family. Vincent and Guido are actually, I believe, second cousins, and they have been friends for a very, very long time, since they were children. And it is just such a lovely story of relationships. Laurie Coleman writes romantic relationships in a way that I think is unparalleled, and I can't think of another author who I love to read the relationship piece of stories as much as I like to read Laurie Coleman's take on relationships, and she's so good at it. And this is such a feel-good book. It ends on such a lovely note. There's nothing about it I don't like. I just adore it. I can't gush about it enough. You know I love it. If it sounds good to you, definitely pick it up. It is well worth a read. Okay, so those are my 2 rereads for the month. And now let us get into the rest of the books that I read. We are going to start with the book that I DNF'd this month, and this made me really sad, actually, to DNF this, because I was really looking forward to it. I have read other books by this author and enjoyed them, even though it's been a really long time since I have read her. This was on my TBR 24 and 24. And I'm so sad to say that it didn't work for me, and that is The Printed Letter Bookshop by Catherine Ray. I had really high hopes. It sounds wonderful. There's a bookstore, there's a small town, you know, there's a cat on the cover. What more could I possibly want in a book? But for me, one of the things I've discovered as my reading life has progressed is that I dislike when authors create situations for their characters solely for the purpose of moving the plot along. And it felt like there was a lot of that going on here. So either there's some sort of tension or conflict that doesn't feel natural to me, and the characters' reactions to things don't feel natural to me. And that's what was going on here and what was bothering me. And I gave it 50 pages, which is usually my benchmark for whether a book is working for me or not. And this one, it just wasn't. It wasn't terrible. There was nothing horrible about it, but it just isn't the book for me in this season of my life. So I'm going to pass this book along, and I'm sure it will give joy to someone else. I think I understand why people love this book. It's just not the book for me right now. And then the next book that I read was the only nonfiction book that I read this month, and I mentioned that I was going to be picking this up, and I finally did. It's been on my shelf for so long, and that is Dewey. And this is The Small Town Library Cat Who Touched the World, written by Vicki Myron. And I really liked this book. I loved Dewey. He sounds like he was an exceptional cat and the perfect cat to live in a library. He had such personality. He was so loving and tender with the patrons who came into the library, and I really loved that about him. He was playful and silly and just all those quirky characteristics that cats have. If you have cats, you know what I mean. But there were some things about this book that I didn't completely love. Vicki Myron gets a lot into her own personal story. And for me personally, I think I would have preferred it if we had just gotten more stories about Dewey from other people's perspectives, rather than Vicki sharing like her own personal history in here. She shares some history about the library and the town, and I thought like that was important to the story, but I thought it would have been nice if she could have maybe gotten in touch with other library staff, other patrons, asked them to share stories about Dewey. To me, that would have just made this book just that much better. So it was enjoyable. I really loved all of the pieces about Dewey, and I will always be a fan of cat books. And I mean, look at his little face. How can you not love that? So I recommend this, but like I said, it wasn't a perfect read for me, but it was enjoyable. And then the next book that I read was the group read for Spinster September. If you're new here and you don't know Spinster September, it is a read-along hosted by Nora over at Pear Jelly on Instagram. I'll have a link to her account down below, and also to the interview I did with her here on my channel if you're interested in watching that as well. But Nora selected a book for the group read, and you could join her and others in the Instagram messages and share your thoughts about the book, and there was a lively discussion about it. And the book that she selected was Rhine Journey by Anne Schlee. And this is actually a book that was written in the 1980s, but it is set in 1851. And we follow Charlotte, and she is traveling down the Rhine River on vacation with her brother, her brother's wife, and her niece. And Charlotte has recently stopped being a sort of lady's companion to a woman who has passed away. And now she's sort of at a loss as to where her life is going to go from there. And there is the possibility that she will end up living with her brother and his family if they make that offer to her. And really, we just sort of follow Charlotte down this river cruise. And early on in the story, she sees a man who she thinks for a moment is a man that she knew when she was younger. And it brings back this flood of memories for her, even though it isn't this man, it's somebody else. And so we get a lot of Charlotte's internal thoughts and emotions. She has a very rich imagination, and we get to see that in this book. And I really was hoping that I was going to love this. If you follow the Lost Ladies of Lit podcast, they have an episode about Rhine Journey, and I will link that in the description box below because it's definitely worth checking out, especially if you've read this book. I highly recommend listening to them talk about it. I was really excited to read this, and it let me down a little bit, and I'm not sure if it's because I just wasn't quite in the mood for the more esoteric, contemplative nature of the writing in this novel, or if it's just that the book didn't really work for me. So I didn't hate it. It's got some beautiful language in it, really evocative scenes, and I thought the ending was great. I'm so glad that it ended the way that it did, but I really struggled to get through it, and I kept falling asleep when I was reading it. The language is quite dense, even though it's a very slim novel, so I didn't find it to be as easy a read as I was hoping it would be. So it was good, and if you're in the mood for something that you can really kind of sink your teeth into and something you have to like really focus on, because you have got to pay attention to what's going on here or you will miss what's happening, is all I'm going to say. And I struggled with that this month, so may just have been timing for me, but well written for sure, but just not a book that I wholly loved. Next up is an audiobook that I listened to, and I finally read another Agatha Christie book this year. I feel like I have not been reading much Agatha Christie. I think probably because I've been doing my Dorothy L. Sayers read through, so I feel like she is fulfilling that need for that kind of classic crime, British crime novel, and so just haven't been picking up Agatha Christie, but I was really in the mood for her in September, and I had this audiobook in my Audible account, and I thought, why not? Let's give it a go. And that was Sparkling Cyanide. And this is a standalone. It features Colonel Race, which is one of Agatha Christie's recurring characters. I think he first shows up in maybe Death on the Nile. I think that might be the first time we meet him. And he shows up in this one as well and helps solve what is going on. But he plays a fairly minor role, and mostly this feels like one of her standalone mysteries. And in this, a woman has died, and they think that it was suicide. It happens when she is out to dinner with a bunch of other people, and she drinks some champagne, and it has poison in it, and she dies. We start the story, and I think it's almost a year later. And it turns out that her husband has been getting letters saying that maybe she didn't commit suicide. She was actually poisoned. And so the husband wants to look into this. Almost on the anniversary of Rosemary's death, he gets together the same group of people back at the same restaurant. And he's going to, you think, maybe sort of reenact or play out what happened and try to find out who done it. And then things don't quite go as planned, and we see what happens there. But then Colonel Race gets involved, and the mystery goes from there. I actually figured out who done it, or I was pretty sure I knew what had happened fairly early on in this one, and it's probably just because I have read so many Agatha Christie books. I still think it was a really fun, enjoyable read. I liked the mystery. It was very twisty because she definitely throws out some red herrings about who it could possibly be. I really enjoyed this one, so I can check that off my Agatha Christie novels that I had left to read. The next book that I finished was the next book in the Little House on the Prairie series, and that is By the Shores of Silver Lake. These are by Laura Ingalls Wilder, of course, and I actually listened to this also on audio because the audiobooks of these, which are narrated by Cherry Jones, but they have, oh, and I should have written down the name of the gentleman who plays the fiddle on the audiobooks because it just adds such a lovely sense of time and place to the books, and I love that little bit of it. So if you haven't listened to the audiobooks of these, I highly recommend them. In this one, there's a bit of a spoiler here, so if you don't want to hear the spoiler, fast forward a few seconds. But at the beginning of this one, Mary has become blind. The family had scarlet fever, and Mary loses her eyesight. If you've watched the TV show, you know what happens to Mary, but that happens in between the last book and this book. So she's already blind when this one begins. And they have been struggling at Plum Creek. And so Pa gets an offer to go work for the railroads that are being built in the Dakota Territory. And so family heads west yet again, and they sort of live more in kind of a town area, and they're kind of waiting to get their homestead in that area once Pa has made some money from working for the railroads. And again, we just follow the Ingalls' lives and what happens to them and the people that they meet and the friends they make, and just her descriptions of prairie life are so wonderful. And I love all the descriptions of them setting up their new houses every time they move. And Ma was a saint, because if I was married to Pa, it would drive me crazy that he kept wanting to like uproot the family and move on, you know, every couple of years or whatever it was. But I loved my time with the Ingalls family again, and I'm looking forward to moving on to the next book in the series. And this has been such a fun read through this year that I just kind of impromptu decided in January to do that, and it's been great. The next book that I read was the pick for September for the Cozy Reader Book Club, and this month we read The Little Village School by Gervais Finn. And in this takes place in an English village, and we follow this little village school, which has just gotten a new head teacher, Elizabeth Devine. She comes in and she's wearing red high heels when she comes for her interview for this position. And so that causes quite a stir in the village. Everybody thinks she's really going to shake things up with her modern ways and change lots of things. And so there's lots of anticipation and some worry about what's going to happen. But Elizabeth Devine is her own person, and she has her own ideas about things. And while she does make change happen at the village school, she does it in really lovely ways and in some unexpected ways. And this is just such a fun, charming book about village life. This is one of the books that would qualify for Spinster September. There are a few different spinsters in this book, and they are supporting characters, but I think they add something to this novel that's really important. So if you wanted to read a book next year for Spinster September that didn't have a spinster as the main character, but you kind of see them in their supporting roles, this is a lovely book to read. I really enjoyed this. I am going to continue on with this series. I think there's 5 or 6 books. in the Little Village School series, or I think it's called the Barton on the Dale series. That's the name of the town. And I'm looking forward to moving forward. I know there were a few people when we had our book club discussion that had a little trouble getting into this, but most everybody enjoyed it by the end. So if you like stories about schools, about village life, then this is definitely the book to pick up. I highly recommend. And then my next book was the next book in the Lord Peter Wimsey mystery series, and that is The Nine Tailors by Dorothy L. Sayers. And in this, we find Lord Peter. He gets stuck in a small English village. His car has some car trouble, and he and Bunter end up staying in this village, and they meet the vicar and his wife, and it's right around New Year's, and he ends up helping them out because influenza is making the rounds through the village, and so one of the bell ringers for the church is very ill and can't ring the bells, and they ring the bells all night long on New Year's Eve. And so Lord Peter offers to step in because he's had a bit of bell ringing experience. And then after Lord Peter leaves, there is a month, I guess maybe sometime in January, there's a body discovered in a recently dug grave where someone else was officially buried in their coffin, and then another body was placed on top of that. And when the woman who had passed away, her husband dies unexpectedly, and they're going to reopen the grave to put him in with her, they find this other body. And so Lord Peter ends up coming back to kind of help figure out who this man was. His face was disfigured, his hands were cut off, nobody knows who he is. They're trying to figure this out. It was very twisty and turny, lots of information about bell ringing. So if you've never read anything about bell ringing in churches, then you get to learn a little bit of that in this one. And I really just loved the village life scenes in this book. I thought the mystery was really well plotted, and the ending was surprising, but when it came about, I was like, that makes complete sense. And I really loved, there is some scenes at the end where there is a bit of a natural disaster happening, and the way this community comes together, that was one of my favorite parts of this book. I just thought that Dorothy L. Sayers played that out so well, and yes, it just makes me want to move to England, to a small village, and be part of that community. And I know those days are probably long gone, but you know, a girl can dream. So this is probably my favorite so far in the Lord Peter Wimsey mystery series. I really love this one. And then next is actually, you know what? I just realized I actually read 2 books for my TBR 24 and 24 in September. I'm silly. So the next 2 books were actually off of my TBR 24 and 24 because the book I DNF'd, I decided to swap it out for another book. But this book that I'm going to talk about right now is one that was on my original TBR 24 and 24 when I started the year, and that was My Antonia by Willa Cather. I cannot believe I've never read this book. I can't believe this is the first time I've even picked up a Willa Cather book. Shame on me, because I absolutely loved this. It was just so, her writing is so beautiful. And again, just like Laura Ingalls Wilder, she talks about prairie life in such an evocative way. And kudos to all of the pioneers who came out and established roots in the United States in its early days, because what a hard life that was. I can't even imagine. We meet Antonia and we learn about her life through the eyes of Jim Burden, who is a young boy who meets Antonia when she is a young girl, and they grow up together, and we follow the story of her life and Jim's life, and it was just wonderful, and I cannot wait to read more Willa Cather. I have Death Comes to the Archbishop, for the Archbishop, one of the two, on my shelf already, and I also just mentioned in my recent book haul that I found The Lost Lady by Willa Cather, which I haven't heard of, but is apparently a reimagining of Madame Bovary. And my friend Melissa commented that she read it last year and really enjoyed it, so I'm looking forward to that one. But if you've read either of those two, which one should I pick up next? And then I definitely want to read the other two books that are in her sort of prairie trilogy. I forget what it's called exactly. And I think they're just loosely linked because they're all set in Nebraska on the prairies. So, Oh Pioneers and, oh, I'm blanking on the third book in the series, but I really want to get my hands on more Willa Cather because I just loved this. It was fantastic. The final three books that I'm going to talk about today were the best of the bunch of September, and I read quite a few books that I really, really enjoyed. So these books were just slightly above the other books that I read that I really enjoyed this year. But the first of them, and this was the book that I swapped for the DNF that I had this month, and so I put this on my TBR 24 and 24, and that is Winning Through by Marcia Willett, and this is the final book in the Chadwick family trilogy. I read the other two books in July and August, or June and July. Can't remember now. Doesn't matter, Jen. Either way, the Chadwick Family Chronicles might be my new favorite family saga, at least in multiple book format. I do love a good family saga that's just in one big chunky book. Things like The Shell Seekers or The Thornbirds. But I think the Chadwick family, they are way, way up there. I adored this trilogy of books, and I felt like Winning Through really wrapped things up in a lovely, lovely way. And I know Marcia Willett has a couple of other books that I think are kind of loosely tied to this trilogy, but these three books wrap up the main Chadwick family stories. So I think you can just read these three and feel like you've completed the series. You don't have to go on and read the other two, even though I probably will because I love the Chadwicks so much and I just want to spend time with them. And one of the books is a Christmas novella, I think, called Christmas at the Keep, I believe. The Keep is the family home, and I'm going to try and get my hands on that and read it in December because I just want to spend more time with the Chadwicks this year. So if you like family sagas, if you enjoy Rosamund Pilcher, I highly recommend the Chadwick family series. Somebody asked me where was a good place to start with Marcia Willett, and I actually think this trilogy is a wonderful place to start. If you can't find this trilogy, the first book I read by Marcia Willett was A Week in Winter, and I really enjoyed that. I also have enjoyed The Children's Hour by her. I highly recommend that one as well. Yes, she is lovely, and she's definitely a read-alike for Rosamund Pilcher. She's not quite as consistent as Rosamund Pilcher. Some of her later books aren't quite as good as her earlier works, but overall, she's still just a lovely, comforting read. The next book I read was another pick for Spinster September, and that was Near Neighbors by Molly Clavering. And in this book, we follow Miss Balfour, and her sister has recently passed away. And her sister was quite domineering and really ruled the roost. And now that her sister is gone, Dorothea sort of comes out of her shell. And there is a family who lived next door to the sisters, lives next door to the sisters, and Dorothea becomes friendly with them, and there are, I believe, 3 girls and 1 boy, and the mother, and they lead just a very sort of seemingly fun-loving, very family-centric life, and they're always bustling, and there's always lots going on, and Dorothea has been watching them from her windows for years and years, and she finally meets them, and things in Dorothea's life, her life just blossoms with the loss of her sister. And as terrible as that sounds, it's probably the best thing that could ever have happened to her. And I just adored this book. It was so wonderful. And if you saw, which of my videos did I talk about this in, where I talked about Tea Jenny? This is the book where I learned the phrase Tea Jenny, which is somebody who loves tea, who is obsessed with tea. That is me. IMT Jenny. Thank you to those of you who've started calling me that because it makes me smile every time I see it. So you can continue to do that if you'd like. Molly Clavering and D.E. Stevenson were friends. So if you enjoy D.E. Stevenson's novels, I definitely think you should give Molly Clavering a try. Because I love this so much, I picked up one of her other books, Dear Hugo, and I have that on my October TBR. If you haven't watched my October TBR video, I will link that here for you and you can see all the things that I'm hoping to read in October, but I highly recommend Near Neighbors. Just such a lovely kind of slice of life story and with a wonderful spinster as a main character who really comes into her own. And I love that. I love when characters come into their own, especially female characters. It's such a lovely feeling. And then the final book, this is a book, I read this in one day. It was such a delight. I checked it out from the library and then I absolutely had to get my own copy of it and found this almost pristine hardback at Half Price Books, and that is Love and Saffron by Kim Fay. This is a novel of friendship, food, and love, and we follow two women. What are their names? It's been such a long time since I've read this. So Joan Bergstrom and Imogen Fortier. They understand the key to a savored life is delicious food. So Joan is young, in her 20s. She's just starting out is she a food critic? Food writer in Los Angeles. This takes place in the 1960s. And Imogen is, I'm not sure they ever say how old Imogen is, but I imagine she's in her like late 50s, early 60s maybe. She writes a food column for a paper or magazine in the Pacific Northwest where she lives with her husband, and Joan has been reading her column because Joan's mother used to read it, and so she writes to Imogen, sends her a little packet of saffron, and they strike up a correspondence, and they become friends through letters, so this is an epistolary novel. You watch their friendship blossom over the years, and through their letters, through their shared love of food, and it is such a beautiful story. I adored it. Get your tissues out at the end because you will probably need them. And I am so tempted to reread this again before the end of the year because I loved it so much. And it's a quick little read. Like I said, it's epistolary and it's fairly short. And I'm so excited because the sequel to this is coming out in the spring and I've already pre-ordered it and I cannot wait. Kim Fay is actually a huge Laurie Colwin fan as well. I discovered that about her through her Instagram account, and yes, I'm a huge fan of this book, of this author, and I can't wait to read more. But this again, huggable book. This was a huggable book. And that is it. Whew. Got through all of the books that I read in September. I'd love to know what you read in September. Did you read something that you absolutely loved? Something that you want to recommend to me? You know, I'm always up for adding new books to my TBR. I'd also love to hear if you've read any of the books that I mentioned in this video, and did you enjoy them or not enjoy them as I did? You know, I love to talk all things bookish with you in the comments. And if you enjoyed this video, I would love it if you could hit that like button, and also if you could subscribe if you're not already subscribed. It really helps my channel. And I'm so thankful that you are here and part of this lovely little bookish corner of the internet. Thank you so much, as always, for watching, and I'll be back with another video very soon. Bye!